Hi class, so we're now in chapter 2, the politics and ethics of social work research. All right, so after this chapter, you should be able to identify the missions and goals of the social work profession, identify the social work skills that are needed to ensure that social work research is used to achieve the mission and the goals of the profession, discuss interrelationship of politics and research, discuss the implications of applying social work values to research with persons and groups who are historically or who historically have suffered disadvantage, and also describe what is meant by ethics and ethical conduct in research. So here are some historical examples. Okay, so with the first example, with the Nazi doctors' experiment on Jewish people from 1940 to 1944, where they were testing the effects of poisons and surgeries on prisoners in their concentration camps. Also, with the Tuskegee study in 1932 to 1972, where they were studying about 600 African Americans. 2/3 of them had syphilis or had contracted syphilis. And in order to observe the long-term effects of the disease, they did a study. Then the men were not given penicillin, even though the medical profession had known that the drug could be used to treat syphilis. They were not given the drug because they wanted to see how it affected them. And so 40 men died during the experiment, and this is what's known as the Tuskegee study. And also, not only men, but wives and children also became affected because of that. The other one, let's see. The other one was the Willowbrook State School in 1955, where they deliberately infected 700 developmentally delayed children with hepatitis to test whether the effects of the gamma globin without informed consent. So basically they were testing the effects of that medication without anyone's consent, because as you're going to learn later on, you cannot, like, people with any kind of mental or developmental challenges are not able to give consent, and so you can't just have a study or do a study on them, but that is something that you're going to learn later on. And so the thing about that one is, yes, the children couldn't give consent, but they didn't even reach out to the parents for consent either. So they just basically took advantage of the developmentally challenged children without asking permission. And that's why today things have changed, and we do have an IRB, and we do have to go through specific guidelines in terms of before we can even do a study. So we are going to go through the whole process in terms of how to fill out the form for IRB, what the questions look like, and things like that. But we're not actually going to submit it because we're not actually going to do the study. Unless you want to, we can also do that as well. But the plan is to actually go through all the steps as if you were going to do a study, but we're not planning on submitting to IRB unless you really want to do the study full out. But you'll learn about that as well later on in the semester. Those results are, okay? So when it comes to funding and research, you can get funding from different areas. It can be federal funding, state funding, nonprofit, foundations, social agencies, even individuals can provide these funds. But just remember that their agenda may try to influence the type of research it is, the topic, and even the results of those research, right? So depending on who you're working for, who your funder is, that may affect what you can do in terms of that research project. Politics can also influence the level of funding you receive. So depending on the actual topic that you're doing it on and how it fits in the whole how it fits in the whole political world, that may also affect how much funding you get. As long as it's something that is in their interest, you may get better funding, right? A request for proposal, or the RFP, is something that outlines what projects will be considered for funding. And your research proposal should match their priorities. So if you're filling out a specific request for funding, you have to make sure that you fill out their form and fill out all information that they're requesting and follow their format. A lot of times, the topics that are more popular is what also receives more funding. If you're researching a topic that nobody cares about, or doesn't have as much interest, it's very likely that you're not going to get funding, or you may get very little funding for it. Again, all has to do with politics. All right. Again, the policy of agency research. So why do you think that agencies may want to do research in their agency? So there's several reasons. They may need to improve services, right? So if they want to see if their program is working, if the services provided are effective, they may want to find out ways that they can improve those services, and research would be a good way to do that. They may want to please funders and supporters, like I mentioned before. If you're getting money, if you're getting any type of funding, you will be required to do research to provide evidence that your program or your services are effective. Or also to create a professional image. Research, like I said, if you do research on your program and it does provide evidence that this is a great program, it's working, it's effective, here's the impact of what this program or services is doing, it will definitely be a good image for that agency. Now, there's also some reasons why the agencies may not want to do research. One of them is the concerns about time and money. So a lot of clinical social workers don't want to do research, especially because they feel like it's going to take a lot of time. It's more work for them to do if they have to do clinical stuff and still do research. So it's definitely going to take up more time. It also costs money. They also feel that it takes away from client contact time. So especially clinical social workers feel like the time they're spending on research could be time that they're spending with their actual client. It can also provide negative results, right? And those negative results can be embarrassing to an agency. So if this agency received funding for one of their programs, and at the end of the year, when they evaluate their programs, they found out that the program wasn't really making an impact. Well, that can be embarrassing to them, but not only that, their program will probably stop getting funding. And so they wouldn't want that to happen. And so that's one way that they wouldn't want to do research. The other one is staff resistance to added responsibilities. And I think I talked about this a little bit on the first one as well, where staff may feel, or social workers may feel like, well, I'm already seeing so many clients. Now you're adding more responsibilities. You're adding research on my plate. That's too much. So a lot of times people are resistant to it because they just feel like it's more work. And so they just kind of like try to avoid it, or they don't want anything to do with it. All right, so now we're going to look at both research methods and compare them. So what is the right way of finding knowledge, right? So looking at the research methods, we have quantitative and qualitative research approach. So when it comes to quantitative, this is the type of approach where you can count things. This has to do with numbers. You can use it whenever you have large samples. You know exactly what you want to find out. You use statistics. You actually can generalize your results. You can be objective when it comes to quantitative. It's something that is the research process or a research approach that has been established, and it's also associated with traditional scholarship. When it comes to qualitative research, it's a little bit different. Instead of counting things, we contextualize things. Qualitative is when you have a smaller sample size and you're trying to get more in-depth information, rather than, with large samples. When it comes to qualitative, you discover what you want to find. You don't really know ahead of time what you want to find out. Instead of statistics, with qualitative, you use words. You're trying to find meaning. And so you're more involved in the research process. You're more involved one-on-one with the participants. It's subjective, and it's something that's not as established as the quantitative approach. Another thing is to do a mixed methods approach. That way you're using both approaches. So with mixed method, you use both quantitative and qualitative approach. And it definitely makes your research a lot stronger. For example, you may decide to start off with a quantitative study if you know exactly what you're trying to find out and you have a large sample. And so you may start off with the quantitative approach, but based on your responses, you may decide that you really wanted some more in-depth information about a specific topic. And so then you can just pull a smaller sample from that group and do a qualitative approach to get more in-depth information about a specific topic. Okay, so what are some ethical requirements when it comes to research? All right, so when it comes to research, it's important to know that participation should be voluntary. You shouldn't force anyone to be a part of your study. No loss of services or punishment, so you have to make sure that your clients or participants know that if they participate or not, it will not affect services. They will not be punished. You will not, it shouldn't affect services at all. And they have a right to drop out at any time of the study. So even if they decided that they wanted to be a part of it, and once they got started, if they decided this is not for me, I'm not really wanting to do this anymore, they have a right to drop out at any time. So just making sure that it's really clear that it's completely voluntary and it will not affect any type of services. The other thing to think about is the no harm to participants. So make sure you define harm to them, and also making sure that you justify cost versus benefits, no deception without justification. So anytime you keep any information from the participants, you need to have some type of justification as to why they were deceived. And then the informed consent or assent. So the informed consent, and you're gonna have to fill out one of these for your actual project for this class. But with the informed consent, most of them are standard, and we're actually gonna use the one that A&M Commerce provides. And so you should have a copy of that in our resources folder as well. But when it comes to the informed consent, it should have the purpose of the study. It should have the information for the contact person. So who should they reach out to or contact if they had any questions? It should also provide a description of the activities of the study, how participants are selected, making sure it also has information in there about their right to stop at any time of the study, and also making sure that they understand confidentiality, privacy, and safety of the data. So how are you going to keep their information confidential and private and things like that. Also need to mention the benefits of the study and possible harm, of being in the studies, and whether there's any specific services to help if they need it. So for example, let's say you were doing a study on suicide or depression or something like that. You need to make sure that in that consent, that you have something in there letting participants know that there are possible harms, what those possible harms can be, right? So for example, if someone suffers from depression or someone is someone has some type of experience with suicide, whether it was someone in their family or someone that they knew. One harm that you can think about could be that it can affect them, right? It could make them depressed, or it could make them feel sad, or things like that. So in order to meet that requirement, you need to let them know that here are some possible harm, and even if there's any type of harm that's possible, you need to provide some kind of services for them that if that does happen. So for example, if you're doing one on suicide, making sure that you have a suicide hotline number in the consent form, that if something, if anyone is triggered, they're able to have that information ready, that they can use it if something happens like that. Asking minors and those with guardians for permission. So if you're doing a study with anyone who's under the age of 18, remember that you have to get their informed consent from the parents or their guardian, but you also have to get assent from the actual minors. So that's what the assent is. Assent is the permission that you're getting from the person that's under 18. And then finally, respect for parental rights. So making sure that you know that if their participants is under 18, that their parents do have certain rights, and if parents are refusing for them to be in the study, then you need to respect that as well. And then there's some gender and cultural issues. So whenever it comes to research, we have to think about some sensitivity of language. Can also be an issue. Making sure that you avoid stereotypes in the language that you're using, trying to avoid offensive terms, or also any offensive or biased questions. Be careful the way you word your questions as well. Make sure that you understand your subjects. Spend some time in the culture. If you're doing a research study on a culture that you don't know much about, try to spend some time in that culture to try to get familiar with that culture. That will help you in terms of understanding those participants, and also kind of helping you in terms of what can be offensive in terms of your questions and things like that. One way to do that is to use community scholars and representatives, so people that are familiar with the culture, people who are, representatives of the community. They should be very helpful in terms of helping you with maybe getting some more information about that specific culture. Don't assume that the measurement instrument is valid. So don't assume that because you have a standardized, or just don't assume because you have a specific measurement that it's going to be valid for your particular participants. So sometimes there are some surveys out there that have only been used with, maybe it's only been done with Caucasian females. A lot of times in research, you'll notice that a lot of the sample has to do with Caucasian females. There's not a lot of male representation in research, or minority representation in research. So several studies that I've done, the majority of our participants were white females. And so a lot of times that's what our measurement is based on. And so think about that, and making sure that you validate your instrument especially whenever you're going to use it with a different group. Like I mentioned before, you have to make sure, or try to make sure, that you're pre-testing your method. So you're basically getting more than one gender, different ethnicities, in that way it kind of helps you in terms of your measurement to see if the measurement is valid or whether any changes need to be made. Avoid focus on deficits, and also avoid overgeneralization of your results. So be careful in terms of when you're reporting your results, and not overgeneralizing it to fit all populations, especially when maybe your participants were all from just one ethnic group or from one culture. So be careful when reporting those results as well. All right, so like I talked about the IRB a little bit earlier. So IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. So all organizations that get any type of federal funds must have an IRB. So we do have an IRB here at A&M Commerce. So whenever, if we decided that we do want to do an actual study, we would have to fill out the IRB and we would submit it to the IRB committee. And if they approve our research, then we can go ahead and collect data. So it must get approved before subjects are recruited or research begins. So the first thing to do would be to fill out the IRB and send it in to get approved before you can send out a survey to anyone or start the research project. So this is basically your research plan is carefully reviewed by the panel or the committee members that are trained specifically for this. They would look at the safety of the project, depending on what you're doing. They're looking at how you're going to select your subjects or how you're going to select your participants. They're looking at your consent, what information's on there, making sure that everything that's required as a part of the consent is included. They're also looking at the methodology and making sure that your methodology is appropriate. They also look for things like monitor or look at whether you're using vulnerable populations. So when it comes to vulnerable populations, these are populations that you kind of want to stay away from when it comes to research projects for this class, just for the class. I mean, once you go out in the field and you decided that you wanted to do more research, that's fine. But when it comes to this class, we try to stay away from vulnerable populations just because it's harder to get approval to do research just because they're vulnerable, right? And so there's a lot more that has to go into, there's a lot more that go into this, and so it's harder to get approval. So whenever it has to do with minors, so anyone under the age of 18, people with a disability, pregnant women, prisoners, or people with developmental ability or developmental disability, those are the populations that you will have a harder time getting IRB approval for this class, for sure. Later on in the field, you can definitely do research on them, but it's a lot harder and it's a lot more is going to be required to be able to do research with them. They also monitor research on minors. If you do choose to do research on the vulnerable populations or with minors, they will definitely monitor how the research is done and making sure that, you know, all the requirements are being followed. Another thing they also monitor is sensitive subjects. So if your research project is over a sensitive subject like sex, drugs, or trauma, things like that, IRB is probably going to keep a closer look on that just because those things can be a little bit sensitive, or they may be a little bit more, it can be a little bit more, they can be traumatized, or they may need more specific, they may need specific help, I would say. And so based on the no harm policy, right, we're trying to do no harm. We definitely would need, those are subjects that may trigger some things like, for example, trauma. For example, I can definitely see how trauma can be sensitive and how we have to make sure that we're monitoring our participants and monitoring the study in terms of making sure that those participants are not being traumatized again, or they're not being, they're not falling back on whatever it is that they were traumatized before and it's not affecting them in that way. So those are subjects that will definitely be monitored by IRB as well. With case study, this has to do with in-depth data that may reveal participants even if no names are used. So when it comes to case study, this has to do with one specific person, right? And you get in-depth information about that participant, and because the information is so in-depth, sometimes you may be able to reveal who that participant is, even if you didn't use their name. So we got to be careful with that whenever we use a case study. So we need to make sure we inform the participants that this is possible, and then we need to negotiate with them as to what information we can publish. When it comes to quantitative studies, demographics may also reveal their identity if the group is rare in the sample. So for example, if your sample had a 59-year-old Pacific Islander at Midwest group home. So let's say you're doing this research study in somewhere in the Midwest, right? And you're doing it at the specific group home in the Midwest. Well, let's say you had one participant. They were 59-year-old and they were Pacific Islander at this Midwest group home. Because this is so rare, people in that Midwest group home or people even in that Midwest area may know exactly what participant that is because there's only one 59-year-old Pacific Islander in that area. So sometimes we can still reveal people's identity even though that was not our intention. So we need to make sure we avoid use of small categories that may reveal identity. So we got to be careful when we do studies that may have a small group like that or a rare group. So 2 things about technology: privacy and intent. Privacy has to do with asking yourself, is the content data available for research? When it comes to intent, is it ethical to try to manipulate people's emotion through technology? So think about these issues whenever you're doing your research project, and think about these issues whenever you're coming up with a topic, and not only with coming up with a topic, but when you're formulating your research plan. These are some things that you may want to consider. And this brings us to the end of chapter 2. So now I hope you have a better understanding of the politics and ethics of social work research.